Was the list of the 7 ancient wonders of the world more or less an ancient Greek travel agent's itinerary of tourist traps? Well, kinda. The listing of ancient wonders goes back to at least the 2nd century BC, and we have several lists that are almost all identical from sources varying from the Antipater of Sidon to Herodotus to Callimachus, and are meant to point out 7 sites of the ancient Greek world that everyone should see most likely before they die. How they would see it after they die, it doesn't matter. But what were they? Well, real quick, before we get into it, we have an honorable mention, the Walls of Babylon, which was in many of the early lists, usually replacing the Lighthouse of Alexandria. They were built during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, and yeah, we'll get back to him. But first off, we have the only one that still exists, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built supposedly over 27 years in the 26th century BC, making it also the oldest of the wonders. It stood at 481 feet tall, though it has shrunk due to the outside limestone being removed, as well as the golden topper, now standing at about 454.4 feet, and the base is 755.6 feet square. Who built it? Most likely the Egyptian ruler Khufu, seen as multiple inscriptions of his name have been found in and around the pyramid, as well as much of his family being buried nearby. And no, I don't care what the History Channel says, it was not built by aliens. Next up, we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which may or may not have actually existed. It's believed that they were built under Nebuchadnezzar II sometime around 600 BC, and the story goes that he had the multi-level terraced garden, hence the hanging part of the name, built because his wife was homesick. However, only one account claims that he was responsible, and many actually believe that the Hanging Gardens were real, but instead they were built by Sennacherib and were located in the city of Nineveh. We actually have found more evidence for this, including aqueducts and canals used to bring water to the gardens in Nineveh, and there are far more accounts of a hanging garden in Nineveh than in Babylon. Some believe that putting them in Babylon and being built by Nebuchadnezzar II was simply a case of people mixing up the Hanging Gardens with the walls. Yeah, we talked about those earlier. Either way, what happened to the Hanging Gardens? Well, we don't know. It was destroyed somehow at some point, most likely after the 1st century AD. Then there's the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Now, we've talked about the Temple of Artemis before, mostly about its destruction by arson by Herodotus, but it was actually the middle structure built on that spot. The earliest version of the temple was built sometime during the Bronze Age and was destroyed by a flood in the 7th century BC. It was reconstructed in a much more grandiose form, taking 10 years and being completed in 560 BC and paid for by Croesus of Lydia. This, the most popular version of the temple, was the one destroyed in 356 by Herodotus. There was another temple built over the ruins, but it was also destroyed in 262 by the Goths. Next up is the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which was a giant seated figure about 41 feet tall, made by the Greek sculptor Idias around 435 BC at the sanctuary of Olympia and erected in the Temple of Zeus. The statue was a sculpture of ivory plates and gold panels on a wooden framework. It showed Zeus sitting on a painted cedar wood throne ornamented with ebony, ivory, gold, and precious stones. In 391, that's AD not BC, Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I banned participation in pagan cults, and so he closed all the temples, including the temple at Olympia, leaving the statue and temple to be abandoned. Sometime after this, the statue was destroyed, though we're not quite sure how. The story goes that it was carried off to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in the Great Fire of the Palace of 475. But many also believe that the statue perished along with the temple in a fire in 425. And we have the Pharaohs of Alexandria, also known as the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which was built during the reign of Ptolemy II, so sometime between 280 and 247 BC. It supposedly took 12 years and is believed to have been at least 330 feet in overall height. though some say it was above 380. It acted as both a tourist attraction and a lighthouse for Alexandria's harbor. The lighthouse was severely damaged by 3 earthquakes between 956 and 1323, after which it was abandoned, meaning that it was in use for over 1,000 years and was the 3rd longest surviving ancient wonder, technically surviving at least in part until 1480, when the last of its remnant stones were used to build the citadel of Quape on the site, though it should be added that French divers did find some stones believed to have been part of the lighthouse in 1994. Then we have the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, or the Tomb of Mausolus, supposedly built between 353 and 350 BC in Halicarnassus, both for and at least partially by Mausolus, a native satrap in the Persian Empire who died in 353 BC, as well as his sister wife Artemisia II. It was designed by the Greek architects Satyros and Pythias and is based on the tombs of neighboring Lycia, a territory Mausolus had taken over around 360 BC. It was approximately 480 feet tall, and the 4 sides were adorned with sculptural reliefs, each created by one of 4 Greek sculptors: Leotyras, Bryaxis, Skopas of Paros, and Timotheus. Most likely it took longer than a few years to build, but we're not quite sure exactly how long it took, but it was ultimately destroyed by a series of earthquakes from the 12th to the 15th century. And finally, we have the Colossus of Rhodes, built in 260 BC in the harbor of the city of Rhodes as a celebration of surviving a year-long siege by the Macedonians. The statue was of the Greek sun god Helios and stood about 108 feet tall, roughly the same height as the Statue of Liberty, which many believe it at least partially inspired. And unlike medieval depictions, it did not straddle the harbor entrance, but rather was to the side of it. The statue stood for 54 years until an earthquake in 226 BC that caused significant damage to Rhodes and caused the statue to snap at the knees. But luckily it fell over onto land. It was considered whether or not they should rebuild it, but the Oracle of Delphi made the Rhodians fear that they had offended Helios and they decided not to do it. And there the statue laid for about 800 years, still a tourist attraction until 653, when an Arab force under Muawiyah I captured Rhodes and the statue was melted down and sold to a Jewish merchant. Don't get mad at me, that's what pretty much all the accounts of its final ending say happened. Granted, they were mostly written by Christians, so, saying that Muslims and Jews had something to do with its destruction shouldn't be surprising.